The radio crackled once, then went dead. 12 Navy SEALs, surrounded, bleeding, running out of time and ammunition in a frozen valley that had just become a killing field. Back at the command post, officers crowded around maps and argued. Helicopters sat grounded. A rescue force wasn't coming. Not in this weather. Not through those mountains. Not fast enough to matter. And the one person who could find them read the terrain and changed the outcome. A civilian logistics contractor named Mercer had just been laughed out of the tent. If you've never seen a room full of military officers make the worst decision of their careers, this is that story. Subscribe now, hit the like button, and drop your city and country in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Don't go anywhere, because the woman they dismissed is about to become the only thing standing between 12 men and a body count. The storm came in off the northern ridge like something with a grudge. It didn't build gradually the way weather was supposed to behave in the briefing models. It didn't give them the 2-hour window the meteorologist at Langley had projected with such confidence. It arrived in one dense, howling wall, sleet horizontal, visibility collapsing to 30 meters in under 4 minutes. And it hit Ashen Ridge Valley at exactly the wrong moment, when Bravo Team was 200 meters past the point of no return. Master Chief Elias Cord felt the temperature drop before he saw the sky change. He was moving point, navigating by memory and compass bearing through a draw between two ridgelines when the wind shifted and the cold found the gaps in his kit. He slowed, raised a fist. The 11 men behind him stopped without a sound. Tango 7, Overwatch, he whispered into his headset. Weather is deteriorating faster than the models showed. We're inside the valley, requesting updated exfil window. Static. Then a broken response from the satellite relay. Copy, Bravo Actual. Weather station shows ceiling at 800 feet and dropping. Aviation is grounded until further. Stand by for... The transmission dissolved. Cord lowered his fist and turned slowly. His team materialized out of the dark behind him. 12 men in white-gray camouflage, faces tight, each one reading his expression with the practiced efficiency of operators who'd served together long enough to communicate in posture. His second, Lieutenant J. Purcell, came forward on a low crouch. How bad? Bad enough. Cord checked his GPS. The device showed their position in the valley's lower third, the insertion point another 800 meters northeast, the extraction LZ 4 miles south and uphill. Intel said this valley was clear. Intel also said the weather window was solid. Yeah. Cord looked at the ridgeline above them. I'm starting to see a pattern. They moved again. Slower now, weapons up, each man controlling his breathing against the bite of cold air. The ground beneath them was uneven, loose shale covered by a thin layer of ice that made every step a negotiation. The valley walls rose on both sides, steep and forested, and the tree line above them was invisible in the dark. What happened next took 11 seconds. The first indication was a sound Cord had heard before, the mechanical tick of a PKM machine gun cycling its bolt before firing. He'd heard it in Ramadi. He'd heard it in a drainage ditch outside Kandahar. His body recognized it before his brain did. Contact, the world erupted. 3 positions opened simultaneously. North Ridge, eastern tree line, and somewhere directly behind them on a spur they'd passed 60 seconds ago. Tracer fire stitched the ground. Cord went flat and was already returning fire before he finished shouting, the team scattering into whatever cover the terrain allowed, which wasn't enough. Which was never enough when you were caught in a 3-sided kill zone. Bravo, sit rep, Purcell's voice over the internal net, controlled but urgent. Voices came back in fragments. 2 men down on the east flank. Reyes took a round through the thigh. Kaminsky was hit in the shoulder and not moving. Petty Officer Walsh was screaming something about the northern position having at least 2 guns. The rest were alive and fighting but pinned hard, pressed against ground that offered nothing, trading fire with positions that were elevated and pre-sighted. This wasn't a chance contact. Cord knew it in the first 30 seconds. The placement was deliberate. 3 angles that overlapped, no dead ground between them, initiated the moment Bravo Team passed through the narrowest part of the valley. Someone had known their route. Someone had known their timing. Someone had set this up with patience and tactical competence that went well beyond a militia ambush. He got on the long-range radio while still shooting. Falcon Crest, Broken Arrow. Bravo Team is in contact, Valley Grid Whiskey 7-9er. Three-sided ambush, 2 wounded, requesting immediate fire support and aviation assets. The response came back fast, which meant someone at Falcon Crest had been awake and waiting. Bravo Actual, this is Falcon Crest. Copy your broken arrow. Aviation is grounded. Wind shear at the ridge exceeds aircraft limits. Fire support. Stand by. We're evaluating. Evaluating. Cord put 3 rounds into a muzzle flash on the eastern tree line and pressed harder against the rock he was using for cover. Tell them to evaluate faster, Purcell said from 6 feet away, his voice completely level in a way that meant he was working very hard to keep it that way. 3 miles south through a storm, neither of them could survive in the open. At Falcon Crest Outpost, the command tent. Smelled like burned coffee, wet gear, and the particular tension that fills a room when experienced men realize something has gone deeply wrong. The outpost was a forward operating base in the technical sense, a collection of hardened structures, a communications array, a small vehicle pool, and a landing pad that currently held 2 MH-60 Blackhawks that weren't going anywhere. The mountains surrounding them were invisible in the storm. The anemometer on the roof had been reading 42 knots with gusts to 60 for the last 90 minutes. Captain Nolan Hayes stood at the operations table with his hands flat on the surface, staring at the radio transcript of Bravo Team's contact report. He was 38 years old and had run enough operations to know when something had gone wrong in ways that couldn't be fixed quickly. His jaw was set. His eyes were working through the map in front of him with the focused intensity of a man counting options and finding them insufficient. Around him, the room was organized chaos. Radio operators ran traffic on multiple nets. Intelligence officers pulled satellite imagery that was largely useless given the cloud cover. A logistics officer was on the phone with the aviation element at the main base, 50 miles away, arguing about aircraft limitations in words that kept getting louder and less productive. Lieutenant Mason Drake stood beside Hayes with his arms crossed and his voice already at the volume it went when he was performing confidence rather than feeling it. The team needs to self-extract, Drake said. They've got the training. Weather's bad, but they've operated in worse. We pushed them south on Azimuth 210. They reached the LZ in 3 hours. We have birds ready at first light when the weather breaks. They have 2 critical casualties, Hayes said without looking up. 3 hours in this cold, wounded, being pursued. That's not an extraction. That's a body recovery. I'm not saying it's clean. I'm saying it's what we've got. Then keep thinking. Drake made a sound that wasn't quite a response. He was 29, a lieutenant with 2 combat deployments, and the specific brand of confidence that came from being capable enough to get by without ever being seriously tested. His uniform was pressed. His boots were clean. In a different scenario, those things wouldn't matter. Tonight they did. The other officers in the room were spread across 3 conversations. The aviation element, the fire support coordinator who was working through the geometry of indirect fire in a valley with no good angles, and a pair of intelligence analysts trying to retroactively make sense of how an ambush this organized had materialized without warning. Nobody was making progress. In the corner of the tent, near the secondary map table that served mostly as a surface for equipment, nobody wanted to carry radios charging, extra batteries, a box of printed vehicle manifests. A woman sat on a folding chair and said nothing. She had a notebook open on her knee. She'd been writing in it, slowly and steadily, for the last 12 minutes. Not the frantic scribbling of someone taking notes. The measured, deliberate strokes of someone working through something. Claire Mercer was 34 years old. She was employed by a defense contracting firm whose primary function was logistics coordination, supply chain management, inventory verification, movement tracking, the infrastructure of war that nobody photographed and everybody depended on. She had been at Falcon Crest for 11 days, conducting a routine audit of the outpost's supply accountability. Her badge said contractor, in large letters. Her gear was civilian. She carried no weapon. She had short dark hair that had been damp since she arrived at the outpost that afternoon and hadn't fully dried. She wore a fleece base layer under a rain jacket that was starting to show wear at the elbows. There was a weathered pack leaning against the wall beside her that looked like it had been in more than 11 days' worth of mountains. Nobody had spoken directly to her since the contact report came in. This was not unusual. Claire had learned over years of working in and around military environments that rooms like this had a social geometry as rigid as any formation, who stood where, who spoke when, how information flowed, and who it flowed to. She was at the outermost edge of that geometry. Contractors existed to support the mission, they did not participate in it. That was the understood arrangement. She kept writing in her notebook. What she was writing was a map reconstruction, working from memory of the Valley Topographic Survey she'd reviewed that morning while cross-referencing supply routes, filling in elevation contours and ridgeline positions from recall with the precision of someone who had spent a very long time training herself to remember terrain. She circled something near the top of her reconstruction, looked up at the main map on the operations table, looked back at her notebook, circled it again. Hayes was speaking to the fire support coordinator, his voice low and frustrated. If we put rounds in the valley at that grid, we're just as likely to hit our own team as the threat. The geometry doesn't work. What else do you have? Nothing clean, sir. Not with our guys inside the engagement area and no real-time eyes on. Hayes pressed his fingers against the map. The room kept moving, kept talking, kept burning through options at the rate they were being produced, which was not fast enough. Claire stood up. She moved to the operations table without announcing herself. Hayes noticed her at his peripheral vision, but was mid-thought and didn't redirect. She stood at the edge of the table and looked at the main map. The actual printed topographic survey, large scale, with grease pencil marks showing Bravo Team's last known position and the estimated threat grid. She studied it for 8 seconds. "The command element is here," she said. Her voice was quiet enough that it didn't carry to the far side of the room. Hayes looked at her. Drake looked at her. The fire support coordinator looked at her. She had her finger on the map. The ridgeline above and northeast of the ambush site, a feature designated Hill 407 on the survey, notable for its flat crown and the antenna relay infrastructure the survey notation indicated had been installed there 3 years ago for a telecommunications project that had never been completed. "That's where they're running this from," Claire said. "The relay towers give them elevated comms. The ridgeline gives them observation of the entire valley floor. They pre-positioned from the north because the southern access route is the one we'd expect them to use, so they came in the other direction." She paused. "If you neutralize that position, the ambush elements lose coordination. They'll still fight, but they'll fight without direction. That's survivable for the team." The room had partially stilled. Not completely. Radio operators kept working. A phone call continued at low volume. But the cluster of officers at the operations table had gone quiet with the specific quality of silence that happened when someone said something that landed. Drake spoke first. "I'm sorry." His voice had a tone in it that was not an apology. "Who are you exactly?" "Claire Mercer, logistics contractor." "Right, logistics." He said it the way someone would say, "Okay then. So your expertise here is the map." "The map." He repeated it again, slower this time, and glanced at the other officers in a way that was an invitation to share the absurdity with him. One of the intelligence analysts, a young captain named Torres, was already working to keep his expression neutral. "Right. Ma'am, I appreciate the input, but we have people with actual military training working this problem. So if you could... The relay infrastructure at Hill 407 is documented in the logistics manifest I reviewed this morning," Claire said. She wasn't looking at Drake. She was looking at the map. It was on the original construction survey for the telecommunications project. The access road from the northern ridge was graded for vehicle traffic. If they drove in before the storm, they could have a command element of 4 to 8 personnel up there with a full communications suite. "You got all that from a supply manifest?" The manifest referenced the original site survey. "I read the site survey." Drake turned to Hayes with his hands open, a gesture that said, "This is your call, but I want it on record that this is ridiculous." Hayes was still looking at the map. His expression was harder to read. "Why there and not here?" He pointed to an alternate feature 2 kilometers south. "Elevation. The southern feature is lower by 60 meters and has no existing infrastructure. You'd need to build a communications position from scratch in winter terrain. Hill 407 already had towers, existing anchor points for antennas. Cover from the weather." She paused. "Also, the approach from the north has no existing defensive positions we know about, so any movement from our side would have to come from the south and take time they knew they'd have." The fire support coordinator had moved slightly closer without appearing to do so. Drake hadn't moved. His expression had rearranged into something more controlled than contempt, the precise opposite of agreement. "Captain Hayes," he said, With respect, we've got an active tick and a team that needs solutions, not theories from someone whose job description is counting supply boxes. He paused a beat. Ma'am, I don't mean any disrespect. Yes, you do, Claire said. She said it without heat, without edge. She said it the way someone states a simple observable fact. The sky is gray, the temperature is falling. Yes, you do. Then she looked at Drake directly for the first time, and it was a brief look, not a challenge, just an acknowledgement. Then she looked back at the map. If I'm wrong, she said, you've lost nothing. The position is worth checking. Drake turned away. We don't have reconnaissance assets that can reach that ridge tonight. No, Claire said. The words sat in the air for a moment. Hayes was watching her. No what? No, you don't. She looked at him. But someone could. The room had gone fully still now, not performatively, but the genuine stillness of people recalibrating. Hayes's expression had changed in a way that was difficult to define. Not belief, not exactly. Something more like attention, the kind of attention that precedes a decision. Drake stepped in. Captain, you're not seriously entertaining? Drake. Hayes's voice was quiet, that particular quiet. Drake stopped. Hayes looked at Claire. You're a logistics contractor. Yes. Who reads topographic surveys? When they're relevant to supply route planning, yes. And you're telling me you can reach that ridgeline tonight? Claire didn't answer immediately. She looked at the map once more. Elevation lines, distance, the notated access road on the northern approach. Her expression was the flat, evaluating expression of someone doing math in their head. I need a radio, she said. Long range. And the frequency Bravo team is operating on. The silence that followed was the most complete silence the operations tent had produced all night. It broke when Drake laughed. Not a polite or restrained laugh. A genuine, sharp, slightly incredulous laugh that several other officers in the room reflexively echoed because laughter is contagious when it's given permission. You want the Bravo team, Freck? Drake said. You want to, what, talk them through it from here? Because I've got to be honest, I was following you right up until the part where you're apparently going to do something. Claire looked at him. I'm going to go to them. More silence. Then Torres, the young intelligence captain, said under his breath, to no one in particular, She's serious. Drake's laugh had faded, but the shape of it remained on his face. He looked at Hayes. Hayes was looking at the map. The map and Claire. And something in between them that wasn't either. Ma'am, Drake said, and now the humor in his voice had been replaced by something else, a patience that was its own form of condescension. This is not a suggestion I'm capable of taking seriously. You are a civilian contractor. You have no training that's relevant here. You have no authority. You have no... He paused. I genuinely don't know what you think you have that would let you walk into that valley tonight and do anything other than get yourself killed, but whatever it is, I promise you, the United States military is not going to be responsible for sending an inventory clerk into a combat zone. Claire said nothing. She looked at him for 1 second. 2. The kind of stillness that isn't passive. Then she bent down, picked up her pack from beside the wall. She pulled it onto one shoulder, then the other, adjusting the straps with the precise efficiency of someone who had done this in the dark. She zipped her jacket collar to her chin. Hayes watched her. Mercer, I'm not asking permission, she said. I'm a contractor. I can walk off this outpost anytime I want. She was already at the tent flap. You're asking us to just let you walk out into... Drake started. She pushed through the tent flap and the storm came in for a moment, loud and cold and absolute, and then the flap fell back and she was gone. The room sat with that. Drake looked at Hayes. His expression said several things, foremost among them. You are not going to do anything about that. Hayes was looking at the tent flap. His jaw moved slightly. His radio handset sat on the table beside him. Sir, Torres said quietly, should we? Get the Bravo net up, Hayes said. Keep trying to reach them. He did not say anything else about Claire Mercer. The rain pounded the tent roof. Somewhere outside, in the dark and the sleet, a woman with a weathered pack and no authority, and every reason to stay inside, was walking north. Behind her, in the warmth and light of the command tent, the officers who had laughed returned to their maps and their phones and their insufficiency. And 12 men in a frozen valley were still dying. The storm hit her like a wall the moment she cleared the outpost perimeter. Not gradual, not building, just instant, total, the kind of cold that finds every seam in your clothing and works its way through methodically, like it has time and you don't. The rain had turned to sleet somewhere above the tree line and was coming down at an angle that made every forward step a negotiation with visibility. Claire moved through it without adjusting her pace. The access road north of the outpost was a dirt track that the weather had turned into a channel of shallow, freezing mud. Her boots found the edges, harder ground, grass roots, less likely to swallow a foot, and she moved along the margin without thinking about it, the way you navigate familiar terrain in the dark. Which this wasn't. Which didn't matter. She had memorized the survey. That was the thing nobody in the tent had understood, or more precisely, nobody in the tent had thought to ask about. The topographic survey for the Ashen Ridge region had been in the logistics package because 3 supply routes ran through the valley system, and the contracting firm needed route assessment data. Claire had reviewed it that morning while cross-referencing delivery manifests. She'd spent 40 minutes with it. That was enough. She turned northeast where the road bent. In her pack, a compact spotting scope, a first aid kit built beyond standard contractor issue, 8 liters of water, emergency rations for 4 days, a radio she'd requisitioned from the outpost's secondary communications locker under her contractor access credentials. The locker nobody had bothered to lock because it held equipment nobody currently needed. The radio was already tuned to Bravo Team's primary operating frequency. She hadn't told anyone about the other thing in the pack. The case was hard-sided, black, just under a meter long. It weighed 11 pounds. It had been in her vehicle since she drove through the outpost gate 11 days ago, signed in as personal equipment, logged as a surveying instrument, which was technically accurate in the sense that it could be used to take precise measurements at long range. She'd been carrying it for 7 years. Inside the valley, Elias Cord was performing the specific calculus of men who are running out of ammunition. They'd burned through roughly 40% in the first 18 minutes of contact. Running out of cover. The position they'd consolidated into was a rocky outcropping on the valley's western wall, defensible but not indefinitely. Running out of time, Reyes had a tourniquet on his thigh that had been on for 22 minutes, and the math on that was not good. Kaminsky was worse. The shoulder wound was a through and through, but it had hit something on the way out that made him go gray every time he moved, and he'd stopped being communicative 12 minutes ago, which was its own kind of bad sign. Purcell was beside Cord in the rocks, magazine count done, face in the expression he got when the numbers didn't add up. 31 enemy contacts confirmed, Purcell said. We've dropped 7. That's 24 maneuvering elements, plus whatever command structure is running coordination. They're not rushing us. No. They're waiting. Yeah. Purcell checked the ridgeline above. They know we can't go anywhere. They've got time. Cord keyed the radio. The signal was degraded. The valley walls and the weather were doing things to propagation that made every transmission a gamble. Falcon Crest, Bravo Actual, sitrep, 2 critical casualties, ammunition at 60%, enemy maintaining encirclement. No movement in 6 minutes. They're waiting us out. We need a viable option. The response came back broken, then clarified. Copy Bravo Actual. Aviation still grounded. Working fire support angles. Stand by. Petty Officer Wren, their medic, came low across the rocks and landed beside Cord with the particular economy of movement that combat medics develop because they cross open ground at the worst possible times. Kaminsky needs a hospital, not a field dressing, Wren said. His pressure's dropping. I've got him stable, but stable is a temporary condition here. How long? Wren looked at him without the expression Cord wanted. I'm not answering that question. Give me a number. 2 hours before I'm out of options. Maybe less if he keeps... Wren stopped. Repositioned. A burst of fire came off the northern position and chipped rocks 6 feet to their left. Nobody moved. The return fire from Walsh and 2 other operators was immediate, accurate, economical. 2 hours, Wren finished. And that's if nobody else gets hit. Cord pressed his back against the rock. Above him, the storm had settled into a steady, grinding presence. Not dramatic, just relentless. The temperature was still dropping. He could feel it in his hands, the way his fingers were starting to lose their fine responsiveness, the trigger pull getting incrementally heavier. He'd been in bad positions before. He knew what they felt like. This was a bad position. Falcon Crest isn't sending anyone, Purcell said. It wasn't a question. Not tonight. So we're self-extracting. With 2 critical casualties and 24 armed contacts between us and the LZ. Purcell said nothing for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was lower. What are our actual options, Elias? Cord had been running that calculation since the first shots. We hold until first light, hope the weather breaks, get air. Or we try to break contact south and accept we're going to take more casualties doing it. Or? There is no or. Purcell nodded slowly. First light is 4 hours. Yeah. Neither of them said the obvious thing. Walsh came up on the net. North position just shifted. They moved 2 shooters to the tree line above us. I think they're setting up for a push. Cord checked the ridgeline. Walsh was right. The northern machine gun had gone quiet. Not out of ammunition, not suppressed, but repositioned, which meant they were changing tactics, which meant the waiting was over. All elements, Cord said into the net, voice level. Prepare for a push from the north. Stack your shots. Nobody burns a magazine on suppression unless you have a confirmed target. We are counting every round. He pulled out his compass, ran the azimuth to the southern LZ in his head. 4 miles, 2 critical casualties, 24 enemies with high ground and patience and apparently good communications. He looked at Purcell. Purcell looked back. The northern ridgeline was moving. Claire reached the base of Hill 407 at 1 hour and 14 minutes after leaving the outpost. 11 miles of mountain terrain in a storm. She would have said, if anyone had asked, that she'd moved faster in worse conditions. She would not have elaborated on when or where. The access road had petered out 2 miles back. Graded earth giving way to a vehicle track, then a footpath, then nothing but slope and rock and the northeastern tree line she'd memorized from the survey. She'd navigated by compass and elevation change, tracking the contour lines in her head, adjusting when the terrain didn't match exactly what she'd recalled, and then adjusting again until it did. She was wet through. Her hands were cold enough that she'd pulled her gloves on 40 minutes ago and hadn't taken them off since. Her pack was heavier than it had been in a while, and she felt that weight in her hips and shoulders in the specific way that reminded her she was 34 and not 24, and the mountain had opinions about the difference. She crested the last rise below the summit and stopped. The antenna towers were there, 2 of them, rusted orange metal, visible even through the dark and weather, exactly where the survey notation had placed them, 40 meters ahead. And between her and the towers, light. Not much. 2 chemical light sticks arranged on the ground, green, tactical, the kind that gave just enough for a map reading without advertising a position from distance. And around the light, figures. She counted 4 initially, then a 5th, moving at the edge of the illuminated area. She went flat. The case came off her back slowly, methodically, no sound. Her gloves came off and went in her jacket pocket. Her fingers complained about this immediately, and she ignored them with the efficiency of long practice. The rifle was a Macmillan TAC 338, bolt action, chambered in .338 Lapua Magnum. It had a suppressor mounted at the factory specification and a Schmidt and Bender 525/56 scope that she'd zeroed herself on the vehicle range at the contracting firm's regional hub, which had a maximum distance of 800 meters, which was less than she sometimes needed but more than she needed tonight. She built the position in 40 seconds. Bipod forward, rear bag from the pack, body indexed to the first target through habit she'd stopped thinking about years ago. The scope came up. 5 personnel. A communications suite, 2 radios, a laptop with what appeared to be drone video feed, a handheld device she identified as a signal booster. One man was speaking into a radio handset continuously, running control traffic. He was the command element. The other 4 were a security detail, 2 facing out, 2 moving between the comms equipment, and a position further back in the rocks. She keyed her radio. Bravo team, this is Overwatch, radio check. Static. Then nothing. The signal was still fighting the terrain. She adjusted the antenna angle and tried again, using the frequency she'd memorized from the outpost equipment log. Bravo actual, this is Overwatch, radio check, break. A pause. Long enough that she was already planning what she would do without communication. Then, station calling Bravo, identify. Cord's voice. Controlled, clipped, skeptical. Call me Overwatch. I have eyes on what I believe is the command element running your ambush. Hill 407, northeast of your position. 5 personnel, comms suite, running coordination traffic. Confirm you are receiving enemy coordinated fire. A longer pause. Confirmed. Something in his voice had shifted. Not belief, not yet, but the particular quality of a man who is weighing information against his need for it to be accurate. Who are you? Someone who read the map better than the people who should have. She put the scope on the radio operator. I'm going to disrupt their command coordination. When I do, their ambush elements will lose synchronization. You need to be ready to move south the moment the northern position goes quiet. Do you copy? Another pause. Then Purcell's voice in the background, not for her. She sounds calm. And Cord back on the radio. The radio, copy Overwatch, what's your timeline? Claire looked through the scope. The command element's radio operator had just transmitted and was waiting for a response, his eyes on the laptop screen. Now, she said. She clicked off the radio and put it down. And then she became something she'd spent the last 4 years pretending she wasn't. The wind was gusting 12 to 15 knots, left to right, which the scope's environmental compensation adjusted for automatically, which she adjusted for again manually because she'd never entirely trusted automatic anything. The range to the command position was 340 meters. The rain was cutting visibility, but not at this angle. She was shooting with the slope, not across it, and the precipitation fell mostly behind the target plane. She took one breath, let half of it out. Her finger moved. The suppressor reduced the report to something that wouldn't carry above the storm noise, a sharp mechanical crack that died in the sleet before it reached the antenna towers. The radio operator folded, 2 seconds. The security element didn't react immediately. Suppressed fire at distance, in poor weather, from an unseen position produces a delay between the event and the understanding of the event. That delay was all she needed. The second shot was already downrange before the first man hit the ground. The third came 11 seconds after that, because the remaining personnel had moved, scrambling, disorganized, no idea which direction the threat was in, which was correct because the threat was in a direction that didn't make tactical sense given the terrain they'd scouted. That had been intentional. The fourth shot took 20 seconds because the remaining security element had done something right, gone flat, distributed, put terrain between themselves and the angles they could identify. She had to wait. She was good at waiting. When she had the shot, she took it. The fifth personnel, the one furthest back, partially concealed, had stopped moving. She kept the scope on him for 45 seconds, and he didn't move again, and she marked his position in her memory and moved on. She keyed the radio. Bravo Actual, command element is down. Their comms traffic is going to go quiet in the next 60 to 90 seconds. The ambush elements will start to lose coordination after that. You need to move now. South, stay close to the western wall. There's a defilade at approximately 800 meters that will give you cover from the eastern position. Go fast. Cord came back immediately. Copy. Moving. Then a half-second pause. Not tactical. Something else. Who are you? Claire was already repositioning, sliding back from the scope, checking the ridgeline below for movement. Overwatch, she said. Keep moving. She broke down the position in 30 seconds, reassembled the case, shouldered the pack, and began moving south along the ridge, paralleling Bravo Team's exfil route from above, staying high, staying invisible, and watching everything below through the spotting scope she kept in her jacket pocket. When the northern machine gun went quiet 8 minutes later, because the operator who'd been receiving directional commands from Hill 407 had stopped receiving anything, she was already in position on the secondary ridgeline, watching 3 enemy fighters moving to cut off the southern escape route. She took 2 of them. The third ran. She led him. And in the operations tent at Falcon Crest, Lieutenant Mason Drake was standing at the radio terminal listening to a calm female voice directing a combat operation in real time, his coffee growing cold in his hand, his mouth slightly open, unable to think of a single thing to say that the situation hadn't already made ridiculous. The third man ran south along the tree line, and Claire watched him go through the spotting scope until he disappeared into the dark. She didn't pursue. She marked his direction, filed it, and moved on. A running man was a problem for later. The men being carried through a valley 400 meters below her were a problem for right now. She repositioned along the ridge at a low jog, packed tight against her back, the case slung across her shoulders in a way that distributed the weight without restricting her movement. The sleet had eased marginally, still coming down, still cold enough to matter, but the horizontal ferocity of the earlier storm had moderated into something merely miserable rather than actively dangerous. She used the brake to move faster. Below and to the east, she could track Bravo Team's progress by sound more than sight. Disciplined movement, feet on rock, the occasional shift of equipment, the low-controlled breathing of men who were working hard and saying nothing. Cord had them tight and moving, which was exactly right. She kept pace with them from above, staying on the western ridgeline, using the elevation to see further south along their route. The eastern position was still active. She'd counted it in her initial assessment, 2 shooters in the tree line on the valley's eastern wall, elevated maybe 40 meters above the valley floor, with good angles on the central approach. When the command element went down, they'd fired sporadically for about 90 seconds and then gone quiet, which meant they were either confused or waiting for orders that were no longer coming. Either way, they hadn't repositioned, which was both good and a problem. Good because they weren't adapting. Problem because they were still in a location that would give them shots at Bravo Team if the team's route drifted east. She got on the radio. Bravo Actual, eastern position is still manned, 2 shooters, tree line at your 2 o'clock from current position. Stay tight to the western wall. Do not let your route drift. Acknowledge. Cord came back in 4 seconds. Acknowledged. We're western wall. Kaminsky is mobile. Reyes is carried. Pace is slower than I want. How far to the defilade? 400 meters. I'll hold the eastern position from here. Keep moving. A pause. Copy that, Overwatch. She found a stable platform on the ridge, a natural rock shelf, flat enough, partially sheltered from the wind by a granite outcropping above it, and set the rifle. The eastern position was at roughly 460 meters from her current location, longer than the Hill 407 shots. The angle was harder. She was shooting down and across, the crosswind more of a factor at this distance. She ran the numbers in her head. Adjusted the scope's elevation turret 2 clicks. The eastern shooters hadn't moved. She found them in the scope, 2 figures in the tree line, one prone behind a fallen log, one kneeling at the edge of cover. They were watching the valley floor below. They hadn't looked up and back toward her ridgeline because nobody expected a threat from that direction. She waited until Bravo Team's sounds told her they were close to the defilade. Close enough. Then she took the prone shooter first because a prone position is a committed position. Slower to react, slower to move. The kneeling shooter would have a half-second of confusion after the first shot, and she needed to be already in the second trigger pull by then. She was. The valley went quiet except for the storm. Eastern position is clear, she said into the radio. Move through. Below her, Bravo Team moved through. Down. At Falcon Crest, the operations tent had developed a particular atmosphere that Hayes had experienced in different forms before, but never quite like this. It was the atmosphere of people who had been wrong and knew it, and were in the process of understanding exactly how wrong, which was worse than not knowing, because there was nothing to do with the understanding except stand in it. Drake had stopped talking approximately 6 minutes ago. He stood at the radio terminal with his arms crossed and his eyes on the speaker, and every transmission from the valley, Cords-controlled check-ins, the Overwatch voice cutting through with position updates and clearance reports, landed in the tent with the weight of evidence. The fire support coordinator, a captain named Briggs, had moved to the far side of the table and was staring at the map with an expression that was technically professional but contained something else underneath it. He'd been the one, 40 minutes ago, who'd said the eastern position was inaccessible from any fire support platform they could bring to bear. Torres had a notepad and was writing things down. He'd been writing things down for the last 20 minutes. Whatever he was writing, he wasn't sharing. Hayes stood where he'd been standing for most of the night, map table, hands flat, listening. His expression had changed incrementally as the night progressed. It had moved through concern, through focused problem-solving, through a period of visible frustration when the options kept coming back insufficient, and had arrived somewhere that was harder to categorize. Watchful, recalibrating. He keyed the radio. Overwatch, Falcon Crest, sitrep on Bravo Team status. Her voice came back without delay. Bravo Team is through the defilade and moving south. Pace is limited by 2 critical casualties. Enemy elements are disorganized following command disruption. I have 3 confirmed pursuit elements. They're moving, but not coordinated. I'm tracking. Can you maintain overwatch to the LZ? A pause. Not hesitation. Calculation. 3 miles south from current position. Terrain changes at the 2-mile mark. Valley opens and the ridgeline drops. I'll lose the elevation advantage. I'll need to move to keep ahead of their route. Understood. What do you need? Another pause. Shorter. Nothing from here. Hayes stared at the speaker for a moment. Then he set down the handset and looked at Drake. Drake looked back at him. His arms were still crossed. Don't, Drake said. Don't what? Don't give me the look. I don't have a look. You have a look, sir. You've had it for the last 20 minutes. Hayes straightened up from the table, picked up his coffee. It was cold. He drank it anyway. Get aviation on the line. I want a weather update every 15 minutes. The moment that ceiling lifts to minimums, I want birds in the air. Yes, sir. Briggs moved to the radio. Drake hadn't moved. She could still get herself killed out there. Yes. Or get them killed. Possible. So we're just... Drake stopped. Restated. We're just listening to a contractor run an unsanctioned solo combat operation in an active TIC. We're listening to the only thing working, Hayes said. He set down the coffee. Which tells me something about the other things we were doing. The tent went quiet. Not the productive quiet of people working. The other kind. Torres looked up from his notepad. He'd written something and underlined it twice. He didn't say what it was. Cord's world had narrowed to the next 10 meters of ground. That was how it went in movement under fire with casualties. You stopped thinking about the mission, the objective, the strategic situation. You thought about footing, cover, the man behind you, the man being carried, the next 10 meters of ground, then the 10 after that. Reyes was being moved in a modified drag carry, 2 operators, arms under his shoulders, heels dragging. It was brutal and slow, and it was hurting him, but the alternatives were worse. He wasn't complaining. He'd gone quiet in the last 20 minutes, which Cord didn't read as a good sign, but Wren had checked him twice and given the thumbs up both times, and Wren was his one reliable data point. Kaminsky was moving on his own feet. Barely. Walsh had him by the arm and was essentially steering him, which worked as long as Kaminsky kept putting one foot in front of the other, which he was doing with the blank mechanical determination of someone running entirely on adrenaline and stubbornness. The defilade had given them 3 minutes of genuine cover, a rock formation that blocked the eastern tree line's line of sight and let them consolidate, let Wren do a rapid assessment, let Cord get an actual count. 10 operational personnel, 2 critical casualties, ammunition at roughly 40% and decreasing. The Overwatch voice had said move through, and they'd moved through. Since then, she'd transmitted twice, once to redirect them around a position she'd identified 50 meters east of their planned route, once to tell them the 3 pursuit elements were at 200 meters and closing slower than expected because they were being cautious. Being cautious meant they'd been hit enough to think about consequences. Purcell came up beside Cord, matching his pace. She's moving with us, Purcell said. He'd been tracking the ridgeline to the west. I can't see her, but she repositioned twice in the last 10 minutes. She's staying above our route. Yeah. She called out that eastern position before we were even in the angle. Purcell paused. She wasn't guessing. No. So who is she? She told me her call sign. I mean, who is she? Cord glanced at the ridgeline. Nothing visible. Just dark and rock and the steady fall of cold rain. Someone who's keeping us alive tonight. Everything else can wait. Purcell was quiet for 10 paces. Then, the voice is familiar. I can't place it. How do you mean? The cadence, the way she calls targets, the pause before the range, then the position, then the action. That's a specific training pattern. Cord knew the pattern Purcell meant. He'd heard it before too. He just hadn't let himself think about what it implied. Keep moving, Cord said. Ahead of them, the valley began to widen. The walls stepping back, the floor broadening, the tree coverage thinning. Open ground. The worst ground to cross with casualties and active pursuit. Cord gauged the distance to the next cover, a broken rock field 200 meters south, and did the arithmetic. Overwatch. Bravo actual. We're approaching the open section. 200 meters to the rock field. 3 active pursuit elements at our 6. What's your assessment? The response came back in 5 seconds. The 5-second delay was the part that was hardest. That window where you were committing to a course of action and waiting to find out if it was the wrong one. 2 of the 3 pursuit elements have stopped, 150 meters northeast of your position. They're not moving forward. They may have lost visual in the terrain change. The 3rd element is moving, but he's going northeast, not south. You have a window. Use it now. Moving. He turned back to the team. Hand signals. Fast, direct. Everyone read it. The carries adjusted, the pace changed, and Bravo team crossed 200 meters of open valley floor with the particular controlled urgency of people who understood that hurrying and panicking were different things. They reached the rock field and went to ground. Cord counted heads. 12. Still 12. He let out a breath that he hadn't realized he'd been holding. She was moving again. The ridgeline had dropped at the valley's southern opening, exactly as she'd told Hayes it would. She'd descended 300 meters of elevation in 11 minutes, cutting across the slope on angles that weren't trails but were functional, her boots finding purchase on wet rock through a combination of technique and the kind of physical memory that doesn't live in the brain. Her legs were burning. Her shoulder, the left one, had started its particular complaint at the 2-mile mark, an old injury, scar tissue that tightened in cold weather. Not serious, but a consistent reminder of a specific night in a specific country that she did not think about while operational. She adjusted the pack strap and kept moving. Below her, the valley floor was opening into the broader terrain that led south toward the extraction LZ. She could see Bravo team's movement, a dark, low-profile cluster of figures crossing the open section toward the rock field with the heavy, effortful pace of people carrying weight. They made it. She kept moving south, paralleling their route at a lower elevation now, the rifle on her back and the spotting scope in her hand. The pursuit elements had stalled where she'd told Cord they would. Terrain confusion compounded by the loss of command coordination, individual fighters making individual decisions without a structure to report to. They were still out there. They were still a factor. But they were reactive now rather than deliberate, and reactive was survivable. The 3rd pursuit element had gone northeast. She'd told Cord that, and it was accurate, but what she hadn't said was why. She'd watched him through the scope long enough to see him key a radio 3 times and get nothing back, and then sit down against a tree for 40 seconds, and then stand and walk northeast, and the northeast direction led back toward where the command element had been, because that was where his chain of command was, and his chain of command was no longer operational. She'd made that choice. She understood its weight and kept moving. The LZ was a flat shelf of ground at the valley's southern end, a natural clearing approximately 80 meters across, currently sitting under 400 feet of solid cloud ceiling that was doing exactly what the meteorologist's model had gotten wrong. The weather hadn't broken. It wasn't going to break in the next hour. She'd been watching the cloud base since she left the outpost, and it had lifted perhaps 50 feet in the last 90 minutes. Not enough. She got on the radio. Falcon Crest, Overwatch, LZ conditions, ceiling 400 feet, wind northwest at approximately 20 knots, gusting, not flyable. You need to know that. Hayes came back immediately. Copy. We're tracking. Aviation is monitoring. The team will reach the LZ in approximately 30 minutes at current pace. If you don't have aircraft by then, I know. A pause. She was moving while she talked, which produced a slight variation in her breathing that she controlled. I can hold the perimeter at the LZ while they wait, but I have 2 pursuit elements that will reach that position in 45 to 60 minutes if they get their coordination back. Can they? She thought about the 5th man at Hill 407, the one she'd watched go still and hadn't been able to confirm, possibly. What do you need? She thought about the question. In a different context, from a different person, on a different night, that question had different answers. Tonight it had one. A faster weather window, she said. Hayes didn't respond immediately. When he did, his voice had something in it that wasn't quite apology and wasn't quite respect, but was in the neighborhood of both. Working on it. She clicked off the radio and pushed south. Oh, the LZ was empty when Bravo team reached it. Cord established a perimeter in 40 seconds. His remaining operational personnel spread in a wide arc, weapons out, covering the approaches. Reyes and Kaminsky were set down in the center, Ren immediately at work, his hands moving through the medical kit with the fluency of someone for whom trauma care was a first language. The silence was sudden and strange. No gunfire, no contact, just wind, whined rain, and the sound of men breathing hard. Purcell appeared at Cord's shoulder. "LZ is clear," Purcell said. "For now. No aircraft sounds." "I know." Cord keyed the radio. "Falcon Crest, Bravo team is at the LZ. 2 critical casualties. Perimeter established. Requesting ETA on aviation." The pause before Hayes responded was 2 seconds too long to be entirely comfortable. "Bravo actual. Ceiling is still below minimums. We're monitoring. Stand by." Purcell was watching his face. Cord didn't look at Purcell. "Standing by," he said. He walked the perimeter, checked each position, each face. His team looked the way combat teams looked after a contact of that duration. Depleted, sharp-eyed, the adrenaline converting slowly into the specific exhaustion that comes after sustained high-stress activity. Nobody was in bad shape. Nobody except the 2 men in the center who needed more than a perimeter and a radio call. Walsh stopped him at the northern edge of the perimeter. "Movement," Walsh said. His voice was flat and quiet and certain. 150 meters, northwest tree line, 2 contacts. Cord got on the radio before Walsh finished speaking. "Overwatch, Bravo actual. Contact report, northwest tree line, 150 meters, 2 elements. Confirm." No response. He tried again, static. "Where's our Overwatch?" someone said behind him. Petty Officer Garrett, voice stripped of everything except the question. Cord checked the ridgeline to the west. Dark. Rain. Nothing moving. The northwest tree line moved again. He was about to call a perimeter pullback when a single suppressed shot broke the quiet from somewhere west and above, the sound arriving a half-second before he identified the direction resolving as the western slope 200 meters above the LZ floor. The movement in the northwest tree line stopped, 3 seconds, then a second shot. The tree line stayed still. Cord's radio crackled. 2 contacts, northwest approach. Neutralized. 1 additional element moving south along the eastern perimeter. You're 4 o'clock, approximately 80 meters. Do not engage until I have the angle. Walsh looked at Cord. Cord looked at the eastern approach. 11 seconds of complete silence during which nobody on the perimeter moved and the rain came down and the clouds sat where they'd been sitting all night, and the LZ held its breath. The third shot came from further south than the first 2. She'd moved again, repositioned, found a different angle, a different slope. "Eastern contact neutralized," the radio said. "LZ perimeter is clear. I'm holding the western approach." Purcell exhaled. It was the smallest possible sound. Garrett said nothing. He was looking at the western slope with an expression that had moved entirely past skepticism into something that didn't have a clean name. Cord keyed the radio. "Overwatch. Acknowledged." He paused. The professional thing was to leave it there. He paused 1 second longer. "Thank you." The radio returned static for a moment. Then her voice, steady and matter-of-fact, with no acknowledgement of the thanks. "Falcon Crest, Overwatch. I have 3 more potential pursuit elements east of the LZ, moving slow. I need your aviation timeline." Hayes's voice came back through the speaker, and something in his voice had changed. Not softer, not warmer, but the tone of a man who has recalibrated his understanding of a situation and is speaking from the new position. "Aviation reports ceiling lifting, monitoring, estimating 15 to 20 minutes to minimums." "Copy." A pause. "I'll hold." And she did. For 19 minutes, while the clouds pressed down and the cold deepened and Reyes's breathing went shallow enough that Wren started a fluid line from their last IV bag, and while 3 pursuit elements probed the eastern and southern approaches with the cautious, disorganized movements of fighters who had lost their command thread and were making individual decisions about whether this was worth dying for those 19 minutes, nobody reached the LZ. Not because the pursuit elements were incompetent, because every time one of them moved into a position that would have given them a shot at the perimeter, the shot found them first. From different angles, different elevations, a moving position that the pursuit elements couldn't locate because it kept not being where the last shot came from. Inside the Falcon Crest operations tent, nobody spoke during those 19 minutes, except in functional exchanges about weather data and aircraft status. Drake had moved to the far end of the table. He was holding a pen. He wasn't writing anything. Torres had stopped writing too. He was just listening. Briggs, the fire support coordinator, was watching the weather radar with the expression of a man who has been told how a story ends and is watching the last pages unfold in front of him anyway. The radio transmissions from the LZ were sparse and precise, Cord's check-ins, the Overwatch voice calling positions and clearances, with the flat economy of language that comes from not having attention to spare for anything beyond what needs to be said. At minute 17, the ceiling on the weather radar ticked up to minimums. Aviation, Hayes said. Already lifting, Briggs said. He had the aviation net in his earpiece. Pilot says he's got a window, 15 minutes to the LZ. Hayes put both hands on the table. Tell him to move. The radio crackled. Cord's voice. Falcon Crest, we have aircraft sounds, south approach. Confirm inbound? Confirmed Bravo, 2 minutes. They're coming in fast. In the perimeter, somebody made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Garrett pressed his fist against his mouth for a half second. Walsh turned his face briefly upward toward the clouds and rain and said nothing. Wren, still working on Reyes, spoke without looking up. 2 minutes is fine. 2 minutes is very fine. Cord stood at the center of the LZ and watched the sky south. He heard the rotors before he saw the lights, the specific frequency of MH-60 blades cutting through the weather, the sound that meant something had gone right. He keyed the radio one more time. Overwatch, aircraft inbound. You need to move to the LZ. Static. Overwatch. Her voice came back. I'm holding the eastern approach. Get your people on the aircraft. I'm not leaving without a head count. A pause. You have 12. Get them on. That's not what I'm counting. Silence on the radio. The helicopter came in low and fast from the south, its landing light cutting through the rain, the rotor wash immediately flattening the wet grass of the LZ floor. The crew chief was visible in the open door before the skids touched ground. Cord began loading his team. Reyes first, then Kaminsky, Wren climbing in immediately after, to continue care. The rest of the team moved fast, practiced, each man accounting for the man beside him. Purcell touched Cord's arm, pointed. She was coming down off the western slope. Not running, moving at the controlled pace she'd maintained all night, measured, deliberate, the pack on her back and the case across her shoulders. Her jacket was dark with rain. Her hair was flat against her head. She crossed the LZ floor without hurrying, reached the aircraft and stopped beside it. Cord looked at her. She looked at him. Neither spoke for a moment. The rotor wash was too loud for anything quiet, and whatever the moment required wasn't loud. He stepped back and gestured toward the aircraft. She pulled herself in. He followed. The crew chief pulled the door and the helicopter lifted, and the valley fell away below them. Dark, wet, still, the LZ receding, the ridgelines dropping into the storm below as they climbed above the ceiling and broke into clear air above the clouds, where the stars were still out and the world was very quiet. Cord looked across the aircraft at Claire Mercer. She had her eyes closed. Her hands were flat on her thighs. There was a cut along her jawline he hadn't seen on the ground, dried blood tracking down into her collar, and she was breathing carefully in a way that suggested something hurt, that she wasn't going to say hurt. Purcell was watching her too. He leaned close to Cord and said, barely audible over the rotors, I know where I've heard that pattern. Cord looked at him. She sounds like the instructors, the advanced instructors, the ones from the program they don't put on any official roster. Cord looked back at Claire. Her eyes were still closed. Her jaw was set in the particular way of someone managing pain, with their teeth clenched around it. He thought about the 11 miles in the storm, the shot on Hill 407 at 340 meters in rain and dark, the way she'd moved the position between shots without ever losing track of Bravo Team's route below. The radio calls, not guesses, not approximations, but exact position data delivered with the confidence of someone who was seeing what she said she was seeing, always. He thought about the logistics contractor's badge on her jacket, visible now in the aircraft's interior light. He thought about the case across her back, the hard black case she'd carried 11 miles up a mountain and used to save 12 lives, and was now holding against her side with the casual ownership of someone who had been carrying it for a very long time. Purcell was still watching him. Cord said nothing. The helicopter flew south through clear air above the clouds, and the mountains receded, and the storm stayed below them like something that had already done everything it was going to do. The base hospital at Kessler Forward Operating Base was a prefabricated structure that smelled like antiseptic and recycled air and the specific institutional exhaustion of a facility that had been running at surge capacity for 3 weeks longer than its design spec intended. Reyes went through the doors first, the gurney moving fast, the surgical team already gloved and waiting because Hayes had transmitted ahead. Kaminsky followed 60 seconds later in a wheelchair that he didn't want to be in and didn't argue about because he lacked the energy. Wren walked alongside, talking to the receiving physician in the compressed, precise language of a medic transferring care. Vitals, interventions, timelines, estimated blood loss. All of it delivered while still moving, the handoff seamless because Wren had been preparing it in his head since the helicopter. The rest of Bravo team filed through the intake area and stopped. There were 11 men in wet, torn gear standing under fluorescent lights that were too bright after 4 hours of dark and storm. Several of them were bleeding from things they hadn't prioritized enough to mention. Walsh had a deep laceration on his forearm from rock fragment impact that he'd wrapped with medical tape somewhere in the valley and forgotten about. Petty Officer Garrett was moving with a hitch in his right side that he kept trying not to show. Someone had lost a boot insert and was walking with the uneven hitch of a man pretending his foot was fine. They looked the way a team looks after the kind of night that used up everything. Cord stood at the entrance to the intake area and turned back. Claire had not come inside. She was on the tarmac outside the facility entrance, about 15 meters back from the door, standing in the area between the landing pad lights and the building. She'd set the case down beside her feet and dropped the pack next to it, and was standing with her arms at her sides in the posture of someone who has reached the end of a sustained effort and is now just existing, just breathing, letting the effort metabolize. The cut on her jaw had dried but reopened slightly during the flight. She'd pressed her sleeve against it at some point, and the dark stain was there on the cuff of her rain jacket. Her boots were caked with mud to mid-calf. She was looking at the horizon, which in the pre-dawn dark was just the absence of stars where the mountains began. Cord walked back out. She heard him coming and didn't turn. He stopped beside her. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The helicopter had already lifted and gone, and the tarmac was quiet except for the base's ambient generator hum and the distant sound of vehicle traffic on the perimeter road. "Both of them are going to make it," Cord said. "Reyes and Kaminsky. The surgical team here is good." Claire nodded. Small, once. "That's because of tonight," he said. She didn't respond to that directly. "How's the rest of your team?" "Intact," he paused. "Because of tonight. Because of tonight." She turned and looked at him. Her eyes were steady. Not hard, not soft. The particular quality of someone who has stopped performing whatever expression they thought the situation required and is just looking. "You don't have to do this." "Do what?" "Whatever you're about to do." She glanced at the door. "I'm going to file my contractor report, get my equipment back to the vehicle lockup, and finish the inventory audit in the morning. That's the job." Cord looked at her for a long moment. "That's not all you are." She picked up the pack. "Tonight it is," she said. She walked inside. He stood on the tarmac for 10 seconds, watching the door she'd gone through, then followed. At Falcon Crest, the debrief began at 0430 hours, in the same operations tent that had hosted the worst 2 hours of Lieutenant Mason Drake's professional career. Hayes had transmitted ahead, and the debrief assembly was waiting when the transport from Kessler arrived. 2 CID investigators, a special operations liaison whose rank insignia was 1 grade higher than anyone else in the room, a JAG officer whose presence nobody explained but everyone understood, and a signals intelligence analyst who'd been pulled from another assignment and showed up with her coffee and her irritation visible in roughly equal measure. Drake was there. He'd been there the whole time. He hadn't left the operations tent since the contact report, which meant he'd been standing in the same room listening to the same radio for the last 4 hours while a civilian contractor did the thing he'd laughed at her for saying she would do. He looked like someone who had not slept and could not identify which of the several things happening in his chest was the dominant one. Hayes stood at the head of the table. He looked tired in the functional way, the kind of tired that doesn't impair, just settles in the bones. He'd been awake longer than Drake, but wore it differently. "Before we start," Hayes said, "Reyes and Kaminsky are in surgery at Kessler, both expected to survive. That's the outcome metric for tonight." He let that sit for a moment. "Everything else is secondary." The CID investigator, a major named Quill, broad-shouldered, with a legal pad already open, leaned forward. Captain Hayes, our primary concern is the identity and authorization status of the individual operating under the Overwatch call sign. We have radio traffic logs showing 12 transmissions over a 4-hour period from an unregistered operator on the Bravo team primary net. That's a significant protocol violation regardless of— I know what it is, Hayes said. Then you understand why we need to account for it. I understand why you need to account for it. Hayes looked at his own notes. The individual in question is Claire Mercer, a logistics contractor employed by Paragon Support Solutions under contract number. He read a number from his notes. Currently assigned to Falcon Crest for routine supply audit. Quill wrote it down. And she was present in the operations tent during the contact report. Yes. And she left the outpost without authorization. She left the outpost as a civilian contractor exercising her right of movement under civilian status. Hayes paused. There's nothing in her contract or her access agreement that prohibits her from leaving the outpost. There's nothing in her contract that authorizes her to conduct combat operations either. She's a contractor. She doesn't conduct operations. She took a walk in the mountains. Hayes said it with his face entirely level, which was worse than if he'd said it with any visible irony. What happened during that walk is a matter of her account and the radio transcripts. Quill looked at Hayes for a moment. The look was the look of a man who knows he's being given a technical truth that is not the whole truth and is deciding how hard to push on it. He wrote something on his legal pad. We'll need to speak with her directly, he said. She's available, Hayes said. He glanced at Torres, who was sitting against the wall, still with his notepad. Torres left. Claire was in the motor pool when Torres found her. She'd returned the radio to the secondary communications locker and was in the process of doing what she'd told Cord she would do, logging her equipment back into the vehicle manifest, stacking the case in her contractor vehicle's lockbox with the efficiency of someone completing a routine end-of-shift task. The motor pool was lit by 2 overhead fluorescents, one of which was flickering, and it smelled like diesel and wet tarpaulin. Torres stopped in the doorway. She looked up. She'd cleaned the cut on her jaw with something from the first aid kit. There was a thin strip of closure tape across it now, neat, properly oriented, applied by someone who'd done their own field medicine before. She'd changed out of the wet jacket into a fleece that had seen more outdoor use than most people's primary outdoor gear. They're ready for you, Torres said. I know. She closed the lockbox. How many people in the room? CID, SOF Liaison JAG, Captain Hayes. Drake? Torres paused slightly. Yes. She picked up her clipboard, the inventory audit clipboard she'd had with her the entire night, which was either the most mundane or the most deliberate detail about the last 6 hours, depending on how you looked at it. Okay. Torres watched her walk toward him, and there was something in his expression that he hadn't managed to neutral out. Not admiration exactly, more like the look of someone who has just recalculated a set of assumptions from the ground up and is still adjusting. He stepped aside to let her through the door. For what it's worth, he said quietly as she passed, I figured it out. The site survey on Hill 407, I pulled it after the fact. You were right about everything, the access road, the infrastructure, the approach vector. He paused. How did you read it that fast? She stopped, looked at him. Terrain is terrain, she said. It doesn't change between a survey and the actual ground. People change, equipment changes, the mountain stays. She walked on. Torres stood in the motor pool doorway and watched her go and said nothing because there was nothing to add. The debrief room was the operations tent with some of the radio equipment pushed back and folding chairs arranged around the central table. It had the improvised formality of military proceedings that happen in field conditions, genuine weight inside a temporary structure. Claire sat down across from Quill without waiting to be directed to a seat. She put the clipboard on the table in front of her. Hayes was at the end of the table, not between her and Quill, but visible in her peripheral vision, which was where she wanted him. Drake was against the wall, not at the table, standing, arms crossed, wearing an expression she couldn't entirely read, which was notable because he'd been very readable up until this point. Ms. Mercer, Quill began, I want to be transparent about what we're establishing here. This is not a criminal proceeding. You're not under oath. But the events of tonight involve several areas of concern that require official accounting. He opened his legal pad. First, your departure from the Falcon Crest perimeter at approximately 240 hours. Can you describe what prompted that? I believed I had information relevant to the rescue of Bravo team that wasn't being acted on, she said. I shared it. It wasn't received. I chose to act on it independently. You chose to act on it independently, Quill repeated. Can you walk me through what that action involved? She did. She described it factually. The route, the elapsed time, the assessment of Hill 407, the engagements. She used precise language. She did not editorialize. When she described the shots, she said I engaged and gave range and outcome without decoration. Quill's legal pad filled up. The SOF liaison, a full colonel named Reese who had said nothing since the debrief began, was watching Claire with an attention that was categorically different from everyone else's in the room. It wasn't the attention of someone evaluating a situation. It was the attention of someone recognizing something. She noticed. She didn't show that she noticed. Ms. Mercer, Quill said, and his voice had changed slightly. Less procedural, more careful. Your account describes a sequence of precision engagements at ranges between 300 and 460 meters at night in adverse weather, while conducting independent movement across 11 miles of mountain terrain. He paused. That's not a capability that comes from logistics work. No, she said. So how? That's not a question I'm going to answer in this room. Her voice was still even, not hostile, just stating the boundary the way you'd state a fact about the terrain. My contractor agreement covers my duties at this outpost. My background is not part of that agreement. It is if it involves undisclosed military training and equipment, Quill said. The weapon you transported onto this installation was declared on entry, logged as personal surveying equipment under my contractor access agreement, and remains legal personal property. She looked at him. You can verify the entry log. Silence. Reese spoke for the first time. His voice was measured, the particular register of someone who has decided how he's going to handle a situation and is now handling it. Ms. Mercer, you don't have to tell Major Quill anything about your background. He looked at Quill. Because this conversation just hit a classification ceiling that Major Quill doesn't have the clearance to operate above. Quill looked at Reese. Reese looked back at him. The look was not unkind, it was simply the look of a senior officer telling a junior officer that the road ended here. This debrief is concluded for Major Quill's purposes, Reese said. JAG can compile the radio transcripts and the entry log. Everything else goes up the chain. Quill held Reese's gaze for 2 seconds, then closed his legal pad. He picked it up and left the tent without speaking further. The JAG officer followed. The signals analyst packed her equipment with the studied neutrality of someone who has learned to be invisible and followed them out. The tent held Hayes, Reese, Drake, Torres, and Claire. Drake pushed off the wall. His voice, when he used it, had lost most of its polish. You want to tell me what classification ceiling means in this context? No, Reese said. Colonel, Lieutenant. Reese looked at him, and the look was not unkind either, just final. There are things in this room you don't need to know. That's not a slight. That's a structure. Drake looked at Claire. She was looking at the table, not avoiding, just not engaging the way you don't engage with a question that isn't yours to answer. You laughed at her, Hayes said. Drake turned. Hayes was looking at Drake with an expression that had been building across the whole night and had now arrived at its final form. It wasn't anger exactly. Anger would have been easier. It was the expression of someone confronting a specific type of failure and deciding to name it directly. In front of her, in front of the room, you laughed. Drake's jaw moved. And then you kept talking, Hayes said, while she was the only person in that tent who knew what to do. He paused. I want you to think about what you heard on that radio tonight and reconcile it with why you laughed. The tent was very quiet. Drake said nothing. His arms, which had been crossed since the debrief began, dropped to his sides. It was a small physical change. It was not a small thing. Hayes looked away from him. Torres, get me the full radio transcript compiled by 0700. He looked at Reese. Colonel, I need 5 minutes. Everyone else moved to leave. Claire stood, picked up her clipboard. Miss Mercer, Hayes said. She stopped. He looked at her. The expression on his face had none of the performance of authority left in it. Not the command face, not the operational face. Just a man looking at a woman who had walked into a storm when he'd failed to stop her and returned with 12 lives she hadn't been asked to carry. For the record, he said, I should have listened. She looked at him. Yes, she said. You should have. She left. The sun came up at 0612. It came through the operations tent's east-facing gap in the structure's seams, a thin bar of early light that moved across the floor as the minutes passed and eventually reached the map table where the Ashen Ridge survey was still pinned, the grease pencil marks from the night before still legible, Bravo Team's last known position, the threat grid, the estimated engagement areas that had all turned out to be approximately correct. Reese sat across from Hayes at the table with a mug of coffee that had gone cold. Hayes had a mug that was still warm. Neither of them had been sleeping. Who is she? Hayes said. It wasn't quite a question. Reese looked at the map. She's a logistics contractor. Colonel? Reese turned his mug slowly. There are programs, have been programs, that place certain individuals in civilian roles. Extended cover, long-term. People who have reasons to be in proximity to operational environments without being in operational billets. He paused. I'm not confirming anything. I'm giving you context for why the classification ceiling exists. Hayes absorbed that. How long? I don't know, longer than she's been at Falcon Crest. Does her company know? Her company is the cover. Reese drank his cold coffee. She handles the logistics work. She's actually very good at it, from what I understand. The audits are real, the manifests are real. The access to supply chain documentation is real. He set down the mug. And it puts her in every forward operating base, every supply depot, every logistically significant installation in a 200-mile radius, knowing where everything is, knowing the terrain. Hayes stared at the map. The site survey. She read it because that's her job to read the documentation, and she remembered it because that's something else. Who does she report to? Reese looked at him. That's above my ceiling too, Nolan, and I have a high ceiling. Hayes sat with that. Outside, the base was waking up. Vehicle engines, boot steps, the mundane morning sounds of a military installation returning to its routine as if the night before had been a different world, which in some ways it had. She was going to leave before anyone could thank her, Hayes said. She probably still will. She's completing an inventory audit. Yes, Reese almost smiled. She is. Drake found Claire in the supply annex at 0715. It was the part of the outpost that existed specifically for the kind of work that kept everything else functioning. A prefabricated structure stacked with equipment crates, spare parts manifests, and the ordered documentation of the outpost's material reality. Claire was at the secondary count station, working through a physical inventory with the calm, unhurried precision of someone who has nowhere else to be and nothing else on her mind. She heard him come in. She didn't stop counting. He stood in the doorway for a moment. He was still in the same uniform he'd been wearing since the previous afternoon. He looked like someone who had spent the night trying to find the right version of several things he needed to say and had arrived here with none of them fully formed. I'm not sure what to do with last night, he said. She made a notation on her clipboard. That's not something I can help you with. I know. He came further into the room, stopped at the end of the nearest shelf. I laughed at you. Yes. In front of... I know what happened, Lieutenant. I was there. He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, the voice had shed most of its finish. What remained was younger and less certain. The things I said, about logistics, about... You made a judgment based on visible information, Claire said. Badge, role, no visible indicators of relevant capability. That's not an irrational inference. She looked up at him. It's a wrong one, but I understand the logic. He looked at her. You're being generous. I'm being accurate. There's a difference. He said nothing. She went back to the inventory. He stayed where he was, which took something, she recognized. Walking out would have been easier. Standing there in a supply annex being accurate with himself about what the night had exposed, that was harder. You could have not helped them, he said. You could have stayed here. Nobody would have made you go. No. So why? Because they needed help. She said it without looking up. That's the whole answer, Lieutenant. That's the only answer. You keep looking for something more complicated, and there isn't anything. He absorbed that. His hands were in his pockets, which was not a military posture. It was just a person standing in a supply room having a conversation they needed to have. For what it's worth, he said. What you did tonight, put it in the report or don't, she said. It doesn't change the inventory count. He looked at her for another moment. Then he nodded, once, the nod of someone who understands they've been given the only version of closure that's on offer, and it's more honest than what they were looking for, but it'll have to be enough. He left. She heard his boots on the gravel outside, receding, and then just the ambient sound of the bass in the morning and the quiet work of counting what was present and what was missing and making sure the numbers added up. The surgical update came at 0840. Hayes received it in his office, a converted storage room that served the purpose well enough, and stood up from his desk and stood there for a moment with the update printed on a single page in his hands. Both operators had come through. Reyes had needed 4 units of blood and a vascular repair that the surgical team at Kessler had apparently executed with a speed and precision that the attending surgeon described in the report as atypical given field delay, meaning the tourniquet and the field intervention had bought exactly the right amount of time. The repair was clean. He would walk. He would run. He would, according to the surgeon's note, likely return to full-duty status within 4 to 6 months. Kaminsky had a fractured scapula and damage to 2 structures in his shoulder that would require reconstruction. 3 surgeries estimated. Full-duty status was a longer question, but he was awake, and his blood pressure was normal, and the gray pallor that Wren had been fighting for 4 hours in a valley was gone. Hayes put the page on his desk. He sat back down. Through the thin wall of his office, he could hear the base moving. Voices, vehicles, the constant mid-morning noise of a forward installation. 12 men had come back from Ashen Ridge. 2 of them were in hospital beds recovering from surgery they'd needed. 10 of them were here, in this base, alive and present, and probably sleeping off the worst night some of them had ever had. Because a woman who counted supply boxes had read a topographic survey and walked 11 miles in a storm and done something that an entire rescue force with aviation assets and fire support and years of training had been unable to do. He picked up his pen. He began to write. The report took him 40 minutes. When he was done, he read it once, changed 3 words, and read it again. Then he sealed it in a classification envelope and marked it with a designator that took it out of the normal reporting chain and into the one Reese had described, the one that went up and did not stop at any level he could see from where he was sitting. He addressed it to the office above Reese's ceiling. Then he wrote a second report, much shorter, 3 paragraphs. This one went to the standard personnel file for Paragon Support Solutions contractor personnel assigned to Falcon Crest Outpost. The second report documented a logistics contractor who had completed her supply audit in full, maintained accurate accountability across all assigned manifests, and identified 3 documentation discrepancies that had been corrected during the audit period. Exemplary work, the report concluded, recommended for contract renewal. He sealed that one too. He looked at the 2 envelopes on his desk for a moment. Then he picked them both up and carried them to the administrative section. Outside, the morning had fully arrived, sharp and cold and clear, the way mountain mornings go after storm systems pass. The sky a hard blue above the ridgelines, the air thin and bright. The kind of morning that doesn't carry the previous night in it. The kind that starts clean regardless of what the dark held. Cord was at the motor pool. I wasn't doing anything in particular. Leaning against the exterior wall in the weak sunlight, coffee in hand, watching the mountains the way people watch things they've been through and still aren't finished processing. He hadn't slept. He heard Hayes's boots on the gravel, didn't look. Both made it, Hayes said. Cord exhaled. Slow, controlled, the kind of exhale that carries something out with it. Yeah, he said. Wren said. Reyes will be back. Wren said that too. They stood together for a moment. The mountains were very clear in the morning light, ridge after ridge visible to the north, Ashen Ridge among them, anonymous from this distance, just another fold of rock and forest. She's still here, Hayes said, finishing the audit. Cord looked at the mountains. I know. When she's done, she leaves. That's how it works. I know that too. Hayes looked at him. Cord's profile was unreadable in the way of someone who has accepted a thing and is in the process of finding the shape of the acceptance. You're going to let her go. She doesn't need my permission to go anywhere. Cord took a drink of his coffee. It had gone cold. He drank it anyway. She never did. Above them, two ravens crossed the ridgeline, black against blue, moving south, unhurried, already past the mountain and into the clear air beyond it, before either man looked up to watch them go. Hayes turned back toward the command building. He stopped. Elias. He used the first name deliberately. Cord looked at him. For the record, what she did last night, the full account, I'm making sure it's documented where it needs to be documented. He paused. Even if the name doesn't appear anywhere anyone can read it. Cord held his eyes. The morning held its cold, clear quiet around them. The 12 families, Cord said. That's who it's documented for. Hayes nodded. He walked back to the command building. Cord turned back to the mountains, held his coffee, watched the ridge lines where the storm had been and was no longer, and thought about 11 miles of terrain in the dark and what it meant to carry something that long without being asked to carry it. Then he finished his coffee and went inside. The supply annex inventory took Claire 4 hours to complete. Not because it was complicated. She'd done the preliminary count the day before, and the discrepancy list was short, 3-line items, all administrative errors traceable to a manifest entry that had been duplicated during a system migration 2 weeks prior. The correction took 11 minutes. The remaining 3 hours and 49 minutes were the physical count, conducted shelf by shelf, crate by crate, with the same methodical attention she brought to everything that needed to be done correctly. She worked without stopping except once, at 09:30, when she sat on an equipment crate and ate a protein bar from her jacket pocket and drank half a liter of water. The cut on her jaw had stopped being a problem. The shoulder was a persistent background note she continued to ignore. Her hands had warmed up somewhere in the second hour when the annex's heating system finally overcame the residual cold she'd brought in from outside. At 11:42, she closed the final manifest folder and made the last notation on her clipboard. Done. She sat for a moment with the completed clipboard in her hands and the supply annex quiet around her. Through the thin walls, she could hear the base's midday noise, vehicles, voices, a distant aircraft somewhere above the cloud ceiling that had rebuilt after the morning's brief clarity. Normal sounds. The sounds of a place that had already begun absorbing the previous night into its operational routine, converting it from an emergency into a report, from a report into a file, from a file into a data point in someone's quarterly review. That was how it was supposed to work. She put the clipboard on the count station and reached for her pack. The door opened. Colonel Reese filled the frame the way senior officers fill frames, not with physical size, though he had some, but with the particular density of someone who has spent decades making decisions that had weight and carrying that weight without letting it show too much. He was in full uniform. His expression was the expression he'd worn in the debrief, measured, deliberate, giving away exactly what he intended to give away. Behind him was a woman Claire had not seen before. Civilian clothes, government-issue pragmatic, dark slacks, a jacket that was slightly too good for the field, but not good enough for a headquarters building. She was 40, approximately, with short, gray-streaked hair and the kind of stillness that wasn't patience but calculation dressed to look like patience. She carried a single folder. Claire looked at Reese, then at the woman. "You're early," Claire said. "Flight schedule cooperated," Reese said. He came inside. The woman followed. "This is Dr. Ann Ferris. She's going to need some of your time." "I'm done here," Claire said. "I was about to—" "I know." He wasn't apologizing. He also wasn't asking. 30 minutes. Claire set the clipboard back on the count station. They used Hayes's office because it was the most private available space, which said something about the improvised nature of the whole situation. Hayes had vacated it without being told to when he saw Reese and Ferris come through the command building, which said something about his read of the situation. He was in the operations tent, doing administrative work that would occupy him for exactly as long as he needed occupying. Ferris sat across from Claire with the folder open on the desk between them. Reese stood at the wall. He'd positioned himself neither with Ferris nor with Claire, which was the position of someone who was present but not a participant, which meant he'd been told to be there and nothing more. Ferris looked at the folder, then at Claire, and there was something in the look that was evaluative without being unkind. The look of someone conducting an assessment they'd expected to be simpler than it was turning out to be. "How's your shoulder?" Ferris asked. Claire looked at her. "You're favoring your left side," Ferris said. "Subtly, but it's there." Old injury, Claire said. Cold weather. It's managed. When did it happen? That's in the file you're holding. Ferris looked down, turned a page. Kandahar Province, 2019. She looked up. 4 years before you left the program. 3.5. Right. Ferris made a small notation. You operated for 3.5 years with that injury unresolved. It resolved. It just resolved imperfectly. Most things do. Ferris turned another page. Claire, I want to be straightforward with you about why I'm here, because I think you'll respond better to that than to anything indirect. I'd respond better to not being here at all. I know, but here we both are. Ferris closed the folder partially, not all the way, just enough to signal that what she was about to say was coming from her rather than from its contents. Last night created a documentation problem. Not a legal one. Colonel Reese's intervention handled the classification question. Not an operational one. The outcome metrics are about as good as they get. The documentation problem is the gap between what your contractor profile shows and what the radio transcripts and the debrief accounts describe. I told Major Quill what I could tell him. Yes. And that's the problem, because Quill is going to write a report that says a logistics contractor conducted a solo combat operation and neutralized approximately 9 armed personnel in adverse conditions at night using a precision rifle she transported onto the installation as personal equipment. And that report is going to sit in a file somewhere below my classification level and above Quill's. And it's going to be a gap in the documentation that creates questions. Claire said nothing. I need to close that gap, Ferris said, which means I need to understand for the record who you actually are. Not for Quill's file. For mine. The room was quiet except for the ambient sounds of the bass and Reese's breathing, which was slow and controlled. You already know who I am, Claire said. I know what the program file says. I need to hear your version. Why? Ferris looked at her steadily. Because there's a conversation happening above both our heads about what last night means for your current status. And your version of events is the only thing I can put in front of the people having that conversation that carries any weight. Claire looked at the folder, then at Reese. He gave her nothing. Not permission, not discouragement. Just his presence at the wall, which was as neutral as he could make it. She looked at Ferris. What do you want to know? Start with why you left. The briefest pause. I didn't leave. I transitioned. There's a difference? I was offered the contractor placement. I took it. That's a transition. She paused. Leaving would have meant walking away from the access. The contractor role keeps me in the infrastructure. I can still do what needs doing. I just don't have a chain of command telling me when. Ferris wrote something. You find the chain of command limiting. I find certain chains of command limiting, Claire said. Specifically the ones that decide what I'm capable of based on how I look in a room. Reese moved slightly at the wall. Not a reaction, an adjustment, the kind of small movement that happens when something is confirmed. Last night, Ferris said, when you identified the Hill 407 position, walk me through that. It's in the debrief account. I want your account, not the summary. Claire looked at the desk. When she spoke, her voice had the quality of someone describing a process that was entirely internal and didn't have a good external vocabulary. The survey showed telecommunications infrastructure on that ridgeline, existing anchor points, elevated position, access road graded for vehicle traffic from the northern approach. Anyone planning a sustained operation in that valley would want elevated comms and good observation. The southern approach was the tactically obvious choice, which meant a competent planner would use the northern one. She paused. The ambush was too organized for opportunistic positioning. Someone had rehearsed it. Rehearsal takes time and requires a command element that can observe the ground. Hill 407 was the only position in that terrain that met all 3 requirements. How long did it take you to reason through that? Looking at the map, 30 seconds, maybe 40. Ferris wrote. The officers in that room had been looking at the same map for 2 hours, Claire said. It wasn't an accusation, just a fact, delivered with the same flatness as her terrain analysis. I know. Ferris looked up. That's part of the documentation problem, Claire. Not just what you did, but the circumstances under which you had to do it. Because the circumstances reflect on a broader question about how assets like you are utilized. She paused. Or not utilized. The phrase sat in the room. Assets like you. Claire didn't react to it outwardly. She'd been called an asset before, by people who meant it as a compliment and people who meant it as a category, and she'd learned to hear it as the latter regardless of how it was intended, because the latter was more accurate. I did what needed doing, Claire said. The circumstances were what they were. Yes, and the person responsible for those circumstances is Lieutenant Mason Drake, who has 2 combat deployments, a clean record, and a documented pattern of, let me find the right word. Ferris looked at the folder. Confident assumptions, Reese said from the wall. Thank you. Confident assumptions about capability and role that led him to actively discourage the one person in that room who had the correct answer. Ferris closed the folder the rest of the way. How much of last night's delay was attributable to his response to you? I'm not going to quantify that. I'm asking you to try. No. Claire looked at her directly. You made a call based on incomplete information and institutional bias. I've made bad calls too. Documenting his mistake doesn't change the outcome. It might change the next outcome. Maybe. Claire looked at the wall to Ferris's left. Or it generates a report that goes into his file and follows him and changes how he performs, which might not improve anything. I don't know Drake's whole story. I know one night of it. Ferris was quiet for a moment. She looked at Claire with the expression of someone who had expected pushback and received something more nuanced than pushback. You're protecting him, Ferris said. I'm being accurate, Claire said, the same word she'd used with Drake in the supply annex. There's a difference. Drake was in the meal facility when Purcell found him, not eating, sitting at a table with a cup of coffee he'd been through 3 times and was currently on his 4th, staring at the table surface with the specific focus of a man who was not seeing the table. The meal facility was mostly empty at this hour, the midday rush done. A few personnel at distant tables working through late lunches. Purcell set his tray down across from Drake without asking if the seat was taken. Drake looked up. His expression registered Purcell's rank and identity and then went back to something more complicated. Lieutenant, Purcell said. Chief? Purcell ate. Drake watched him eat. The silence was the non-aggressive kind. 2 people in the same general space with different relationships to what the silence contained. You were in the tent the whole time, Purcell said. Yes. Start to finish. Yes. Purcell cut something on his tray. What was that like? Drake turned his coffee cup in a slow quarter turn. Back. Not something I'm going to describe accurately. Try. Drake looked up. Purcell was looking at him without apparent judgment, which was almost worse than judgment because there was nothing to push against. Just a man eating lunch and asking a question. I was wrong, Drake said. That's the accurate description. You were wrong about one thing. I was wrong about the one thing that mattered. Purcell ate for a moment. You know what she did after the command element went down? I was tracking her movement from below. She didn't stop. She repositioned, picked up our route, paralleled it, and held our flank for 3 miles of terrain. He paused. Moving. In the dark. After 11 miles uphill. Drake said nothing. I've worked with good operators, Purcell said. I've worked with excellent operators. What she did last night, the full sequence of it, puts her in a category I can count on one hand. I know that now. You knew something was off when she read the map, Purcell said. In the tent. I could see it in your face. You knew she was right. Drake's jaw tightened. I'm not asking you to admit anything, Purcell said. I'm just... He pushed a piece of food around his tray. I've been thinking about what I would have done if I'd been in that tent, and I'm not sure I'm as certain as I'd like to be that I wouldn't have made the same call. Drake looked at him. That's the thing about this kind of mistake, Purcell said. It's not unusual. That's the part that should scare you. He picked up his fork. The fact that it scares you at all is probably a decent sign. Drake looked at his coffee. He didn't drink it. She could have told me I was wrong, he said. In the tent. She could have argued, pushed harder, made me listen. She made a calculation, Purcell said, that you weren't going to listen regardless of how she made the case, and she was right about that too. He paused. Which is the part that should stay with you. Drake looked at the table. Outside the meal facility, bass sounds moved past in their midday frequency. Somewhere across the compound, a vehicle engine turned over and settled into its running note. Somewhere farther, an aircraft was making its approach to the landing pad. The MH-60s that had been grounded all night were flying again in the morning clarity, making up for lost time. What happens to her now? Drake asked. Nothing, Purcell said. She finishes her audit. She leaves. She goes to the next outpost. Just like that. Just like that. Drake shook his head. The motion was small and wasn't disagreement. It was the motion of someone trying to locate the shape of something that didn't have a satisfying shape. Purcell finished his tray, pushed it aside. For what it's worth, Lieutenant, the men on my team who were in that valley last night, they're not confused about what happened or why. They know exactly what she did and what it cost her to do it. He stood. You should talk to them sometime. He picked up his tray and left. Drake sat alone at the table with his fourth cup of cold coffee and looked at the door Purcell had gone through, and then at the window, and then at the table again. He thought about Reyes and Kaminsky and surgery. He thought about what Purcell had said. She made a calculation that you weren't going to listen regardless of how she made the case. He thought about the moment in the tent when she'd said, "Yes, you do," without any heat in it, and the way she'd picked up her pack. He thought about 12 men in a frozen valley. Then he stopped thinking about it because thinking about it was not the same as doing anything about it, and the only thing available to do was sit with it and understand it fully before he was capable of doing anything useful at all. That would take longer than today. He knew that. He picked up the cold coffee and drank the rest of it. Hayes found Claire on the North Perimeter Road at 1400 hours. She was walking. Not toward anything in particular. The Perimeter Road was a loop, gravel-surfaced, roughly a mile circuit around the outpost's interior boundary. She was on her third circuit, which she told herself was not about anything except the need to move after 4 hours of stationary count work, and which she was approximately 60% convinced by. Hayes fell into step beside her. She didn't ask why he was there or how he'd found her because both answers were obvious and neither was interesting. They walked for a moment without speaking. The afternoon was cold and clear. The mountains were in full view to the north and east, the storm of the previous night having passed completely through, leaving the kind of visibility that made distance deceptive. Ridge lines that looked close enough to touch were an hour of hard climbing. Ferris finished, Hayes said. I know. She told me. What did she say? That the documentation gap is closed, that the radio transcripts will be classified appropriately, that my contractor status is unchanged. Claire paused. And that someone above Reese's pay grade wants a formal review of the authorization structure for personnel in my placement category. What does that mean for you? Probably nothing. Reviews generate recommendations. Recommendations generate policies. Policies take 2 years to implement, and by then the specific situation that generated them has changed. She walked. I'll still be counting supply manifests. Hayes said nothing for a few steps. Is that... He stopped. Is that what? He seemed to be editing something. Is that what you want? She looked at the mountains. The question landed differently than she'd expected it to land, which was probably because it was a genuine question, and she'd been in a building full of procedural questions for most of the morning. It's what I chose, she said. That's not the same thing. No, but it's what I've got. They walked. The gravel crunched under their boots in the steady rhythm of people not in a hurry. A raven crossed the perimeter road 30 meters ahead, low, interested in something on the road surface, then lost interest and lifted back to the tree line. Reese told me something, Hayes said. Not about you specifically, about the placement program. He said the people in those roles tend to be individuals who don't fit the standard operational structure. Not because they're incapable of functioning in it, but because the standard structure can't fully use what they have. He paused. He said it like it was a design feature. I'm not sure it is. It's a trade-off, Claire said. The structure gives you belonging and clear authority and someone to report to and someone to be accountable to. The placement gives you access and flexibility and the ability to act when the structure fails. She walked. Last night the structure failed. Yes. So the trade-off paid off. At a cost. She looked at him sideways. What cost? He met her look. You walked 11 miles in a storm alone. You held a perimeter for 20 minutes solo. You took, 9 engagements? And absorbed the risk of all of them without anyone alongside you. He paused. That's the cost. Not the physical part. The alone part. She was quiet for a moment. I've been alone in worse places, she said. I know. That's not reassuring. She almost smiled. It was a partial thing. one corner of her mouth moving in a way that wasn't quite humor, but was adjacent to it. "You're not responsible for my operational circumstances, Captain." "No, but I was responsible for the tent." She stopped walking. He stopped beside her. The perimeter road ran straight ahead, the gravel slightly damp from the morning's residual weather, the mountains visible beyond the outpost's northern boundary in all their afternoon clarity. "You listened," she said, "at the end, before I left. You were listening." "Not in time to calm. You were listening." She said it without softening it or sharpening it, just the fact of it. "Drake wasn't. You were. That matters." Hayes held her eyes. He looked like a man who wanted to say several things and was choosing between them and ultimately chose nothing, which was sometimes the right choice. She started walking again. He fell back into step. "The audit report is on your administrative desk," she said. "3 discrepancies, all corrected, documentation attached. Supply accountability is clean." She paused. "You should know the vehicle manifest for the Southeastern Depot has a recurring error in how the fuel consumption data gets entered. It'll create a discrepancy in next quarter's audit if nobody corrects the entry format. I left a note." "Thank you." That's the job. They walked the last quarter circuit of the perimeter road in the quiet company of 2 people who have been through something together and are finding the edges of what can be said about it. At the point where the road bent back toward the command building, they both stopped naturally, the way a walk ends. Hayes looked at the mountains one more time. "When do you leave?" "Tomorrow morning. There's a supply convoy to Ashford Station. I'm hitching the first leg." "After that?" "Pembroke Outpost. They have a vehicle parts accountability issue that's been in the system for 6 weeks." He looked at her. Something in his expression, not sentiment, just recognition. The specific recognition of someone who understands what they're looking at. "Take care of the shoulder." "It's managed." "I know. Take care of it anyway." She looked at him. "Yes, sir," she said. She turned and walked toward the supply annex. He watched her go. Cord was at the vehicle lockup at 16:30. Not for any particular reason. He'd checked on his team, gotten the update on Reyes and Kaminsky, handled the immediate after-action administrative requirements, and then found himself standing in the motor pool area without a clear next task, which was unusual enough that he recognized it as a sign of something. He was leaning against the exterior wall when Claire came around the corner with her pack and the case, heading for the contractor vehicle section. She saw him and slowed slightly but didn't stop. He pushed off the wall, fell into step beside her. "I'm not going to make a speech," he said. "I know," she said. "Neither am I." They reached her vehicle, a contractor standard pickup, gray, practical, with a cab that held gear and not much else. She loaded the pack and the case into the lockbox and secured it with the efficiency of someone who loaded that combination regularly. Cord stood at the edge of the vehicle area. "Purcell said you moved with us the whole route." "I had an angle from the ridge." "The whole route?" She closed the lockbox, turned. "Yeah." He looked at her. She looked back. They were approximately the same height, and the eye contact was the level kind. Not a challenge, just 2 people reading each other accurately. "I'm going to ask you something," he said, "and you don't have to answer it." "Okay." "Why logistic? The whole cover? You could have, with your capability, you could have, because logistics is everywhere," she said. "Every outpost, every depot, every forward base. Anyone who needs accountability on their supply chain needs someone like me." She paused. "And every one of those places has a map, and terrain, and situations that need reading." She looked at the lockbox. "The cover and the job are the same. I do both. And when nobody calls for help, I count what's there and what's missing and make sure the numbers add up." She looked at him. Same as last night. The stillness between them was the kind that comes after a thing that has been said as accurately as it can be said and doesn't need additional words around it. Cord nodded. She picked up her remaining bag, a smaller one, personal, that she'd kept out of the lockbox, and slung it over her shoulder. "Kaminsky's going to need 3 surgeries," she said. "Make sure someone's checking in on him. Not officially, just make sure someone's there. Walsh is already planning it." "Good." She opened the cab door. "Tell Wren he saved both of them. The field work bought enough time. He should know that." "He knows." "Tell him anyway." She got in the cab. The engine turned over on the second try. Cold weather reluctance, nothing serious. She let it idle. Cord stood at the driver's window. She didn't roll it down. They looked at each other through the glass for a moment. The specific quality of a goodbye between people who don't do goodbyes well and both know it. He raised one hand. Not a wave, a flat acknowledgement, the kind operators give each other in the field. She put the truck in gear. He stepped back. She pulled out of the vehicle area and into the outpost road, and he watched the gray truck move toward the gate, and the gate opened, and she drove through into the access road and the mountains beyond, and the gate closed. He stood there for a moment. Then Garrett's voice behind him, "She gone?" He turned. Half the team was there. Walsh, Garrett, 3 others, standing at the edge of the motor pool in the afternoon light. They looked the way the team looked, depleted, present, the specific alertness of people who had been awake too long and were operating on the far side of their second wind. "Yeah," Cord said. Nobody said anything for a moment. Walsh looked at the gate. "What's she doing next?" "Pembroke Outpost," Cord said. "Supply accountability." Garrett made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite anything else. "Supply accountability." "That's the job," Cord said. He looked at the gate one more time. The road beyond it was empty. The gray truck already around the first bend, already into the mountains, already somewhere else. He looked at his team. "Come on," he said. "We've got after-action to finish." They went inside. The after-action report took 3 days. Not because the events were complicated to document. Cord had done enough AARs to know that the factual sequence of Bravo Team's contact, movement, and extraction was straightforward to reconstruct. What took 3 days was the rest of it. The parts that didn't fit the standard template. The parts where the reporting field said supporting assets, and the honest answer was a civilian contractor with a rifle. She declared as surveying equipment who read a map better than everyone in the room, and then walked into a storm alone. He wrote it straight. Every detail, every transmission from the Overwatch frequency, every position call, every cleared approach, every minute of the 19-minute hold at the LZ. He wrote it the way it happened, without softening the operational picture or the circumstances that had produced it. And when he got to the section on command tent decision-making, he wrote that straight too. Not to assign blame, but because the record existed to be accurate, and accuracy was the only thing the record was worth. He filed it on day 3, late afternoon, and walked out of the administrative building into the kind of cold that had settled into the mountains for the season now. The kind that wasn't going anywhere until spring. Purcell was waiting outside. He'd been waiting outside for 20 minutes, which Cord knew because he'd seen him through the window. "Done?" Purcell asked. "Done." They walked. No particular direction. The base perimeter road, the same loop Claire had walked 3 days before, which neither of them noted aloud. "Reyes is out of surgical," Purcell said, "transferred to the recovery ward. His wife flew in this morning." "I know. I talked to him yesterday." "How is he?" "Pissed he's going to miss 6 months," Cord walked. "Which means he's fine." Purcell's breath made small clouds in the cold air. "Kaminsky's first reconstruction is scheduled for next week. Walsh is taking leave to be there." "Good." They walked for a moment. "I keep thinking about the 19 minutes at the LZ," Purcell said, "while we were holding the perimeter. 3 contacts probing, and none of them reached us." "I know." "She was moving between shots. I tracked the sound. She wasn't holding one position. She was moving after every engagement so they couldn't locate her." He paused. "In the dark. On a slope she'd never been on before." Cord said nothing. "That's not something you develop in the field," Purcell said. "That kind of instinct for position and counterposition. That's years of specific training that goes well past anything I've seen documented. Some things don't get documented. I know that." Purcell walked. "Reese wouldn't tell me anything. Torres pulled everything he could find on Paragon Support Solutions, and it's exactly what it looks like. A functioning logistics contractor with 17 years of government contracts and a clean record across 40-some installations. Because that's what it is. And also not what it is." Cord glanced at him. "Let it go, Jay." Purcell was quiet for 2 steps. "I'm not trying to pull the thread. I just—" He stopped, restarted. "I want to make sure she's okay, that's all. She had a cut on her jaw and a shoulder injury she wasn't acknowledging, and she drove off in a gray truck at 0 dark whatever, and we just—" He made a gesture. "Let her. She didn't want anything else." "I know that. I just—" He stopped again. Cord looked at him. Purcell's expression was the expression of a man who had survived something and was sitting with the specific unease of knowing someone else made that survival possible and having no way to balance that account. It was an uncomfortable place to sit. Cord understood it because he was sitting in it too. "She's doing her job," Cord said. "At Pembroke right now, she's probably standing in a supply annex counting vehicle parts and writing discrepancy notes in a clipboard." He paused. "And if Pembroke needs something else from her, she'll do that too." Purcell was quiet. "That's who she is," Cord said. "That's the whole answer." They finished the circuit and went back inside. Pembroke Outpost was smaller than Falcon Crest by about a third. Fewer personnel, simpler infrastructure, a vehicle pool that ran 8 units instead of 20, and a supply accountability problem that turned out to be exactly what the intake report had described. 6 weeks of vehicle parts consumption logged against the wrong depot code, creating a phantom deficit on paper that didn't exist in reality. Claire corrected it in 4 hours on her second day. The first day she'd spent reviewing the incoming manifests and identifying the pattern, a data entry convention that one logistics clerk had used and a replacement clerk had misread, producing a systematic error that compounded with each new entry. Not complicated, just tedious to unwind. She unwound it. Pembroke's logistics officer, a young first lieutenant named Chandra, who was 26 and earnest in a way that hadn't been worn down yet, stood at the count station and watched Claire work with the expression of someone watching a mechanic find the one thing they'd missed. "That's it?" Chandra said when Claire set down the corrected manifest. "That's it. 6 weeks of... I've been going through these for 2 weeks. You were looking at the consumption side. The error is on the depot coding." Claire pointed to the entry format. "This column should be the receiving depot code, not the issuing depot code. Whoever trained your replacement clerk reversed them." Chandra stared at the column. I should have caught that." "Probably. You didn't. Now it's corrected." Claire pulled the next manifest. "The backlog takes 2 more days to reconcile. After that, your records will be clean." Chandra stood there for a moment with the look of someone who has been carrying a problem for 2 weeks and has just had it resolved in an afternoon and isn't entirely sure how to recalibrate. "Can I get you anything? Coffee? The mess here is actually decent." "I'm fine," Claire said. She was already into the next manifest. "Close the door on your way out." Chandra closed the door on the way out. Claire worked through the afternoon. At 1800, she stopped and ate the meal she'd picked up from the mess earlier, which had gone partially cold. She ate it at the count station with the manifest open beside her because she was thinking about a discrepancy in the third quarter fuel log that might connect to the part's coding error, and she wanted to check before she lost the thread. She was 3 bites into the meal when her personal phone buzzed. She looked at it. Unknown number. Text message. 3 words. "Reyes is walking." She looked at the message for a moment. Then she put the phone face down and picked up her fork. The discrepancy in the fuel log turned out to connect exactly as she'd suspected. Same error, different category, same clerk rotation timeline. She corrected it and made a note and kept eating, cold food and clean numbers in the quiet of a supply annex at a small outpost in the mountains, and it was enough. It was the job, and the job was what she'd chosen, and she was very good at it, both parts of it. The formal review that Ferris had mentioned convened in the 3rd week. Claire received notification via the encrypted contractor communication channel, a summons to a location she'd been to before, in a building that didn't have a street-facing sign, in a city that she drove to in the same gray truck after completing the Pembroke audit in full and filing the corrected documentation. The building was in a mid-sized city, unremarkable in the way that buildings housing unremarkable, seeming offices are unremarkable. A commercial structure, 7 floors, a lobby with a security desk and a badge reader and a bank of elevators. She signed in under her contractor credentials, took the elevator to the 5th floor, and found the office at the end of a hallway that smelled like commercial carpet and recycled air. Ferris was there. Reese was there. A 3rd person was there. A man Claire had met twice before, both times in rooms like this one, whose name she used and whose function she understood, and whom she thought of primarily as the person 2 levels above Reese's ceiling. She would call him director here, which was accurate enough. The director was 60, approximately. He had the build of someone who had been physically capable for most of his life, and was now capable in the way that comes from maintenance rather than condition. His suit was correct without being expensive. He had a mug of tea on the table in front of him that he'd brought himself, from outside the building, which was the kind of small detail that Claire noticed because she noticed everything. She sat across from him. "How's the shoulder?" he asked. "Managed." "Same answer you gave Anne." "Same answer because it's the same answer." He looked at her without reaction. He'd been looking at people across tables for 40 years and had reached the point where the look itself conveyed nothing, not warmth, not coldness, just presence. "You know why you're here. Review of the Falcon Crest incident and its implications for placement protocol," Claire said. "Ferris told me." "That's the official reason." He turned his tea mug slowly. "The unofficial reason is that I wanted to talk to you directly before this review produces any recommendations, because recommendations have a way of becoming policy before the people they affect have had a chance to weigh in." Ferris, to the side, was making a note on her pad. Reese was at the wall again. Same position, same neutrality. "The review," the director said, "has produced 3 preliminary findings. First, the Falcon Crest incident represents a successful utilization of a placed asset in an unauthorized but effective capacity. Second, the circumstances that necessitated that utilization, specifically, the failure of the command element to act on accurate intelligence due to personnel bias, represent a systemic gap in how placed assets are integrated into operational decision-making. Third, he paused. Third is the one I want to talk to you about. Claire waited. The third finding is that your current placement structure, single contractor, solo operation, no backup, no support chain, is operationally effective but individually unsustainable. He held her eyes. The Falcon Crest operation required 11 miles of solo terrain navigation, 9 precision engagements, and a 19-minute unsupported perimeter hold. You completed it. The question the review is asking is whether completing it was the right call, or whether the structural conditions that made it necessary represent an unacceptable risk concentration. "I made it back," Claire said. "Yes. This time." The 2 words sat in the room. She looked at the table, then back at him. "What are you proposing?" "Options," he said. "The review has 3. First option, your current structure continues unchanged. You complete your placements, you handle what needs handling, you operate solo within the existing framework." He paused. "The review doesn't recommend this." "I know." "Second option, your placement is ended. You're offered a training role. Institutional knowledge transfer. Your capability gets embedded in a program structure rather than deployed directly." He paused. "The review doesn't recommend this either." "Because you'd lose operational access." "Because we'd lose you," he said. "Which is not the same thing." She looked at him. He returned the look with the same measured steadiness. "The third option. Your placement structure is maintained with modification. You retain the contractor cover, the access, the operational flexibility. But you work with a small support element, 2 to 3 people, placed similarly, known to you. Not a team in the conventional sense. No formal command structure. Just people who know what you are and can coordinate when coordination is needed." Silence. Ferris was not writing. Claire looked at the tea mug on the director's side of the table. The logo was from a cafe 2 blocks from the building. He'd walked there this morning before this meeting, in his correct but not expensive suit, and bought tea and walked back. "Who?" she said. "Your call." He said it without hesitation, which meant it had been planned for her to have the call. "People you've worked with, people you trust." "I don't trust easily." "I know, which is why the selection is yours." She thought about Falcon Crest, the tent, the radio, the map, the 11 miles. She thought about what the third option gave and what it cost. The cover was harder to maintain with multiple people, the flexibility narrowed, the operational security more complex. She thought about the 19th minute at the LZ and how the margin had been close enough that she'd noticed it at the time and filed it without acknowledging it. She thought about Reyes walking. "I need time," she said. "You have 2 weeks." "I need 3. He looked at her. 3 weeks. She stood up. "One more thing," the director said. She stopped. "The Falcon Crest command failure. Lieutenant Drake." He looked at his tea. "His record is being reviewed. The specific incident will be noted in a way that follows him." He paused. "Appropriately, given the operational impact of his decision." I want you to know that's happening through normal channels without your report or your input. The radio transcripts are sufficient. I didn't ask for that. No, but you should know it's happening regardless. He looked up. What you did at Falcon Crest, the result of it, those 12 families. He stopped, started again. That matters to more people than you know. She stood at the door. I know who it matters to, she said. That's enough. She left. Drake received his review notification on a Tuesday. It arrived through normal channels, a formal letter, official heading, specific language that was neither accusatory nor exculpatory, but was precise in documenting the sequence of events in the Falcon Crest operations tent and their consequences. The letter noted that no formal disciplinary action was being taken. It noted that the incident had been reviewed at multiple levels. It noted that the documentation would accompany his file through his next 2 performance evaluations. He read it twice in his quarters. Then he sat with it. He'd known it was coming. Purcell had told him, obliquely, that the classification ceiling on the incident didn't preclude standard personnel documentation. He'd spent 2 weeks trying to decide how he felt about that, and had arrived at something that wasn't quite peace with it and wasn't quite resistance either. He deserved it. That was the simple version. The complicated version was that he'd spent the 2 weeks since Falcon Crest doing something he hadn't done systematically before, which was listening before speaking in rooms where he didn't have complete information. It was a small adjustment. It produced noticeable differences in how conversations went and what he learned from them. He wasn't sure if that was growth or just the most basic version of a lesson he should have already had, and he wasn't going to give himself credit either way. He put the letter in his desk drawer. Then he sat down and wrote a letter of his own. Not to anyone official, not to Hayes, not to the review board, not to the chain of command. He wrote it to Paragon Support Solutions, addressed to the logistics contractor currently assigned to Pembroke Outpost, care of the contractor's administrative contact at the company. He wrote it by hand because typed felt like a document, and this wasn't a document. He wrote 4 sentences. I was wrong. Not just about the map, about what I decided you were before you had the chance to be anything. I'm sorry. He signed it with his rank and name and put it in an envelope and sealed it and addressed it and held it for a moment. Then he put it in the outgoing mail. He didn't know if she'd read it. He didn't know if the mail would reach her before she moved to the next outpost, or the one after that. He didn't know if it would matter to her in any measurable way. It mattered to him. That was the part he was learning to sit with. That some things you do because they're right, and not because they change the outcome. He was 39 days into learning that. He didn't know how long it would take to fully absorb. He went back to work. The letter reached Claire at her 3rd placement after Falcon Crest, a supply depot in a flat, windy region that was the opposite of mountains in every way except that it was cold. She found it in the contractor mail stack on her 2nd day, between a manifest update from the company's administrative office and a weather advisory she didn't need. She opened it because she opened everything. She read the 4 sentences. She read them again. She sat with them for a moment. Then she put the letter in the inside pocket of her jacket, the left side, close to the shoulder that ached in the cold, and went back to the manifest stack. She finished the count at 1,700. She filed the preliminary audit notes. She went to the depot's small meal facility and ate a meal that was better than Falcon Crest's and worse than Pembroke's and hot, which was the primary criterion. After dinner, she sat in the contractor quarters, a small room, functional, a cot and a desk, and a window that looked out at the depot's perimeter fence and the flat landscape beyond it, and took out her personal notebook. Not the clipboard. The other notebook, the one she'd had for 4 years, that she'd been writing in the night of the contact report in the Falcon Crest operations tent. She opened it to a fresh page. At the top, she wrote a single word, names. Under it, she wrote 3. She looked at them for a long time. They were people she'd worked alongside, briefly, at various points across the last 4 years. Not friends in the conventional sense, not colleagues in any official capacity, but people whose capability she'd observed and whose judgment she'd assessed and found accurate. People who understood what the work was. People she trusted, which was a short list. She looked at the 3 names. Then she closed the notebook and put it on the desk and turned off the light. The windows showed the perimeter fence and the flat dark beyond it. No mountains here. Different terrain. Different set of things that could go wrong, and different set of skills they would require. The shoulder ached. She shifted position and it settled. She thought about Reyes walking. She thought about Kaminsky's 3 surgeries and Walsh taking leave to be there, and the way Cord had raised his hand flat at the truck window. Not a wave, just an acknowledgement. The kind that meant I see you without requiring anything back. She thought about the director's 3 options and the one she was going to choose, which she'd already known before she left the room. She thought about 12 men in a frozen valley and what it had cost to bring them back, and what it would cost again at the next place, and the place after that, and whether the cost was the right kind to keep paying. It was. She'd known that before she picked up the pack in the Falcon Crest tent. She'd known it before she walked through the tent flap into the rain. She'd known it the whole 11 miles and the whole 19 minutes and the whole flight back above the clouds. You don't do the work for the answer to the question. You do the work because you already have the answer, and it has to be paid in something more than words. She slept. In the morning, she drove the gray truck to the nearest town with a reliable communications connection and used the encrypted contractor channel to send a message to the director's office. 3 words. I'll take option 3. Then below it, 3 weeks. I'll have names. She sent it and drove back to the depot and went to work. The audit took 6 days total. The accountability problem was more complex than the intake report had suggested. 2 overlapping errors in the inventory system that had been masking each other, producing numbers that looked right from one angle and wrong from another. She unraveled them systematically, starting with the oldest records and working forward. And by day 5, she had a clear picture of where the actual inventory sat versus the documented inventory, and the gap was smaller than anyone had thought. On day 6, she filed the corrected documentation, compiled the discrepancy report, and completed the audit summary in the precise, thorough language of someone who takes the work seriously, regardless of what else the work contains. She put the clipboard on the supply officer's desk. She drove the gray truck out the depot's main gate and into the flat landscape with the window cracked 2 inches, letting the cold air in. It smelled like dust and distance, and the particular cleanness of land that doesn't have a lot of trees to complicate the wind. She drove south. In her jacket pocket, close to the shoulder, Drake's letter moved slightly with the truck's motion over uneven road. She hadn't decided what to do with it beyond carrying it, which was its own kind of answer. You carry the things that weigh something, even the things that are too late to change the past, especially those. The road went on. Mountains appeared to the southwest, faint at this distance, suggestions of elevation rather than the real thing. She'd be in them in 3 hours. She had a name written at the top of a notebook page, a message sent, and 3 weeks to build something that had never been built in quite this configuration before. It would be imperfect. The structure would have gaps, and the gaps would produce friction, and the friction would require navigation. That was how things built by real people for real purposes worked. Not clean, not frictionless, not the way it looks on paper before it meets the actual ground. She knew how to navigate ground. The mountains came closer as she drove. She turned on the heat and kept both hands on the wheel and watched the road ahead with the unhurried attention of someone who understands that the distance between where you are and where you're going is not empty. It's full of everything the next thing requires, and you arrive at the next thing having crossed it, carrying what you carried and leaving behind what couldn't come. The gray truck went south. The mountains waited. Some people spend their whole lives waiting to be seen before they act. The ones who change outcomes are the ones who act first, and let the scene